Hey guys, Peter here to tell you about the latest from Municipal Waste Electrified Brain on July 1st on Nuclear Blast. The album has 14 tracks, 34 minutes in length, and this is the band's 7th full-length studio album. They are an American crossover thrash metal band. As far as the design of this record, well, this is the simple part of the review. There is really no design to it. It's balls to the wall, fast and furious, a lot of aggression, a lot of momentum coming at you from the time you press play until the record finishes. There are no ballads, there are no soft songs, there are no moments for you to take a pause or even to take a breath. The only time you can take a breath is before you press play and after the last song is done. This is a very linear sounding record that takes you from point A to point B in the shortest distance possible, and that distance is 34 minutes. That plays to the playability of the record, that makes the album feel a little bit fresher, not allowing the album to sound as repetitive as if the record had gone over the 40-minute mark. You have to be conscious of your sound, you have to be conscious of what you're trying to create, and then make sure that the time frame of the album enhances that creation, enhances that playability, and this album definitely has those attributes. As far as the sound is concerned, this album is interesting to me because when you think about all the great crossover or thrash metal bands, they all have uniquenesses to them, but they're all part of that much larger umbrella. This record comes across that way. If you look at it from distance, all the songs feel the same. They all have very similar attributes. There's not really a track on this album or several tracks on this album that break the mold, that give you a different look, a different vibe, a different atmosphere. No, the album stays very compact, very cohesive from that perspective. But they brought in influences from all different sources, from all different bands that allow them to create a unique sound, a unique style, at least a unique sensation or experience from track to track without necessarily allowing them to go off the beaten path. So this album on one hand offers some diversity, but not enough diversity that makes the tracks stand out from one another. You really have to dig deep in order to find those differences, in order to find those influences. Sometimes you're listening to this record and a riff hits you and you feel like you know exactly where that riff is coming from. The aroma is very familiar to you. Even though it doesn't sound like something you heard before, it has the traces, it has the starting point of something that perhaps has been embedded in your brain. The beauty of creating an album like this really adds to the overall flow, and it really adds to the overall strength of the record, because it's almost like you're listening to a greatest hits that was constructed through a time frame that started at the beginning of the band, that started even before the band was formed, with other bands that influenced them to pick up their own instruments, and now it's taking you all the way to modern time. The record really feels like a time capsule from that perspective as far as the sound and execution is concerned. Within the sound, two elements jump off immediately: the drums and guitars. I personally would have liked to see the drums be slightly heavier. Not necessarily heavier in sound, but heavier in the presence that they would have in the mix, grounding the album ever so slightly. They're right there at the cusp. I wanted them to go a little bit further. It would give more consistency to these tracks, would make them feel slightly bigger. The way they come across in terms of not just of how the album is mixed, but in terms of how the drums are put into that mix, they don't give that sense of thickness to the sound. They allow the sound to be powerful, they allow the sound to be driven, but not as thick as I would like it to be. So I like, on one hand, that they're not overpowering the experience, that they're not overtaking all of the other elements, that they're not overshadowing everything else. But I think there was room, a little bit of room, for them to push themselves a little bit further or a little bit wider so that these tracks would feel more robust and even more demolishing. I don't think it would take anything away from the speed, from the momentum, from the tempo that these tracks are built around. Now, as far as the guitars goes, I love everything about it. The solos, the riffage, the melodies, everything surrounding the guitar work on this album is outstanding. The influences that I talked earlier in the sound really come across in the guitars. You hear some riffs that remind you of early Metallica. You see some songs in terms of how they're constructed, how they're developed, and how the guitar solos are integrated into them. Feels like you're listening to an Exodus track. Some of them have a little bit of an overkill flavor. There's a little bit of everything on this record as far as the history of the genre is concerned. And the guitars are really the storytellers, or the curators, if you will, of what that sound, of what that history is all about. I love the guitar sound, I love the execution, I love the life, the force, the energy that they offer this record. Now, as far as vocals are concerned, what you see is what you get. There didn't change anything. What you saw in previous albums, it's exactly what this album delivers. So there's a consistency from that perspective, a little bit of the glue that holds everything else together. All around, I love the strength, I love the momentum, I love the aggression of this album. But to me, it's undeniable that this record loses a little bit of steam in the last third. And I don't mean that the songs lose momentum or lose tempo or they're not as driven, but there's something in the execution, there's something in the experience that the last third of the album gives that is not as consistent as the first 2/3 of the record. So it's an album that goes a little bit lower down the scale instead of staying very linear from start to finish. It loses a little bit of the consistency that it had, and it starts to show as you get closer to the end of the album. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Demoralizer. This is the second track on the record. It has a little bit of a Metallica vibe, specifically as it opens. Once you get through that opening, the song becomes a lot more robust, becomes a lot more powerful, a lot heavier, a lot more aggressive. It has a great guitar sound all around. It has an old school approach to that guitar sound, and if that old school approach doesn't stay just in the guitar sound, it moves also to how the vocals come across and how the vocals are introduced within the track, coming from the back all the way to the front. Something that's very old school, but something that works really well for a track that has this sort of intensity. The intensity that you get when you throw gasoline into the fire. That's how this track comes across. Great solo, great song all around. Next you have Last Crawl, which is the track that comes right after, and this one is even throwing more fuel into the fire. Like it wasn't enough from the previous track, this one throws even more. But when you look at this track, when you look at the construction of the song, when you look at the sound, where the chorus comes in, how the chorus comes across, how catchy, how hooky it is, the solo, everything about this track gives me Exodus vibes. It just feels like something that you would get out of one of those records, out of, Bonded by Blood, for example. It has some of those attributes from that record into this song, but it obviously been put through the Municipal Waste blender, so it doesn't come across as a copy. It just comes across as a song that has that influence in the background, but sounds very fresh and very attached to the band that's currently performing it. I love the sound, I love the drive, and like I said, throwing even more gasoline into the fire. Last but not least, Restless and Wicked. Great track, great momentum, great vibe, great sounding song, almost like if Midnight was to do a thrash metal song. That's how this track comes across. It has some Motorhead vibes to it because it sounds very rock and roll. The guitar riff, the guitar sound all around feels very pure rock and roll. It feels more rock and roll than thrash metal, and that vibe is really important to create the overall sensation that this song is trying to create. Once again, very aggressive, balls to the wall, doesn't hold back. It has great vibe, great sound, great vocals that go with it, and the energy is just outstanding from beginning to end. A track that has some ebbs and flows throughout, but never really loses track of where it was and where it's going, and it tries to get you there as fast, as brutally as possible. This is it, Municipal Waste with Electrified Brain, an album that I'm not quite sure if it makes your brain feel electrified, but it definitely gives you a little bit of a jolt. Out July 1st on Nuclear Blast. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.